Welcome back to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager.
And I'm Ollie Douglas, the curator of the museum's collections.
In this episode, we're continuing our conversation with Professor Dolly Jørgensen about medieval pigs, the presence of pigs in medieval urban and rural settings, by thinking about the significance of pigs, what pigs meant in literature, in religion.
Yeah. What do pigs mean to you, Joe?
I mean, I love pigs.
Have you ever been to any of those places where you can cuddle a pig?
When I was a kid,
They're amazing. Something quite calming when you cuddle a pig. Not a full-grown adult pig. I wouldn't recommend that. That'd be quite scary, and they're very heavy.
Well, in many ways, that's what we're going to explore with Dolly. The tensions around pigs between being big and cuddly, and also quite dangerous and quite wild.
Yeah.
Welcome back, Dolly. It's great to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me again.
So last time you were with us, we chatted about medieval pigs, where pigs were in the cities, the ubiquity of pigs. This time, we're going to talk more about pigs in the mind. We're going to talk about what pigs represent, what pigs mean. I'd love to begin and go back way, way into antiquity. So what were the earliest kind of significant Western philosophers saying about pigs? How did pigs function at that point in history?
Well, so people have lived with pigs for a long time. They have become symbols of thinking, of associating with humans. So pigs themselves have particular traits that get associated with particular human traits. So often pigs are thought of, and we still do it today, they'll think of them as dirty, right? Because they roll around in the mud. Now, in reality, pigs aren't dirty. They're rolling around in the mud to, one, control parasites, and two, keep themselves cool, because they're actually really sensitive to sunlight and heat. But they look muddy. And because of that, they will tend to get, philosophers will say, well, so they're like unclean people, right? They're dirty and not keeping themselves up. Even though that's not, in fact, what's going on at all with a pig. There's also a tendency to look at pigs as particularly good breeders, right? They have a lot of babies at one time. So very different, let's say, than a cow, which will have a calf, or a sheep that is going to have 2 lambs. Pigs will have many piglets. And so people kind of associate that, going back to Roman writers, people like Pliny will say, well, that's because they're sexually deviant, that they have so many babies. When in fact, that's not, again, at all why that's happening. But there's certain traits that then get associated with humans. And so they become easy to compare to people.
So it's that sort of explains why Peppa Pig's a thing. You know, we're still anthropomorphizing pigs even today, and you know, giving them human characteristics, and you know. And
you learn lessons. You learn lessons from pigs, right? So, so that is precisely so. In the medieval period, one of the things that gets made are these manuscripts called bestiaries. So medieval bestiaries are a book in which they catalog all the different animals that exist, and they'll tell a story about that animal, and they'll describe some of its, what we would call biology. Of course, they didn't call it that, but it's, you know, characteristics and its traits and how big it is and how many, you know, what kind of cycles it has or whatever. But then they'll always have a moral of the story. And in the medieval bestiaries, these are going to be Christian morals, because Western Christianity. And so you're going to use animals to tell stories about people. And so pigs are used in this way, often to tell stories about people being unclean living in sin, because they're like a pig being in the mud.
Yeah. So that negative association with pigs that we have in contemporary language is about those kind of negative associations, I guess, a whole mixture of them. I'm remembering when I was a child, my sister wrote a sign for her bedroom door. She wasn't very good at spelling, but it was a sign that said "Grills is grills and boys is big pigs." She's being very gendered, banning the boys.
Can we accession that?
I don't think it still exists, but that sense that boyishness is piggishness is negative.
Right? You still say that, right?
Yeah, well, I'm reminded that when I grew up, one of my neighbours' houses had a tiny ornamental pig outside with a sign, and it just said, "My husband is a big fat pig."
That's really weird thing to.
It is
really weird thing to tell all your neighbours.
They were a very lovely couple, but there was a. Yeah, but it is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, that really negative association. It comes through in sort of attitudes towards the police,
and even in the roles given to pigs as well. I mean, I'm thinking about Animal Farm, for example. Yeah. They're bad pigs. Yeah,
they're not good pigs. We don't like those pigs.
No.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Well, some pigs are more equal than others, right? So it's exactly this that we continue to use. Like you say, something is that somebody's a pig, or that, your room's a pig pen, kind of associations of it being dirty. Now, you mentioned also greedy. That's the other thing, that in medieval texts, pigs will be associated with being greedy, because they eat, as we mentioned last time, just about anything. I mean, they're not picky, in other words, on what they eat.
It's really weird, though, that they're criticizing the pigs for that, because that's one of their primary useful things, isn't it? They're eating whatever you throw at them. It's not like, the fight I might have with my children, for example, about what they might or might not eat.
And they're being used specifically to do that as well. It's humans. It's human agriculturalists using pigs to do these jobs, and yet at the same time they're being maligned. Yeah,
exactly. It seems a bit mean.
You can't win.
Yeah.
Well, you can hold multiple things, I guess, in your mind at the same time, which is that the pig can be really useful doing this, and yet from I guess a moral of the story perspective, it can be seen as a negative virtue or trait.
Yeah, and what we were saying in that earlier episode is that pigs are everywhere. So if pigs are everywhere, they're a point of reference all the time.
Exactly. So you get that, the greed and association with gluttony. So images of kind of the 7 deadly sins. Gluttony is one of those. So sometimes a pig will appear then as gluttony. And then there's the, association with being lewd. So having loose morals. And this shows up in some of the associations of pigs with prostitutes. So one of the earliest urban laws, sanitation laws, comes from York. And in that law, it puts pigs and prostitutes into the same sentence about pigs and prostitutes not being allowed to wander the streets. So there's an interesting, very early, in the 1300s and already association between that kind of, them as 2 different beings that somehow operated the same. They had the same kind of morals. And then in France, you get some really nice images. There's some in manuscripts too, but some really nice images of pigs who are playing instruments. And that's also associated with prostitution. So there's some kind of deep imagery that's going on in medieval thought, but kind of pigs that are dancing, pigs that are playing lutes. There's even some bagpiping pigs.
I'm mindful of something Ollie said about Peppa Pig. And it does seem striking that you have pigs at both ends of the spectrum. Pigs are either, dirty, gluttonous, sinful, or they are the sign of innocence and morality. I mean, is there a history to that side of pigs in the medieval or sort of antiquity as well?
They do show up as if you will, at least, I guess, neutral to positive in saint stories. So in the Middle Ages, you would write down different stories, tales about the saints, and those would be told then. And people would end up writing them, but often you heard them as oral stories. And pigs show up in several different ones of those, including St. Bridget in Ireland, who ends up having pigs that she's herding and ends up in a miracle saving the pigs from a wolf kind of setup. You have pigs that become associated with St. Anthony. This is the biggest one in the later Middle Ages. So St. Anthony had been a hermit in the very earliest days of Christianity. He was not associated with pigs in his earliest writings, but by the 1400s, they start making hospitals with the monks of St. Anthony's, and they're taking care of people who are sick, elderly, disabled. So this was a common way that medieval hospitals worked. And one of the things they start having are pigs. And they were given special permission in towns to allow their pigs, unlike everybody else's pigs, to roam free in the town. And so these are seen as positive because they belong to St. Anthony's Hospital, but they get to wear a bell. So sometimes in images, you'll see a pig with a bell. That's a St. Anthony's pig. And that was so that everybody would know this pig was okay.
Does that relate in any way to the tradition of praying to St. Anthony to find things? Because I think of St. Anthony as the patron saint of lost things. You know, you say a prayer to St. Anthony when you've lost something. It feels like pigs in the medieval world might well get lost because everyone's got them, and they're running all over the place, and they're out in the woods and they're around the town, and
yeah. Oh, that's interesting. He is also the patron saint of swineherds. Then
okay.
So yeah.
And how are swineherds affected by this? Do they get a bad name or a good name or a neutral name because they're linked with pigs? Is there like a sort of knock on? Do the pigs rub off on people in a bad way?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. You know, I haven't seen anything about it being negative for swineherds. There is some negativity about butchers, you know, because you're dealing with things that you're going to kill, and there's you know, some uncleanliness about being around that materials. But no, I haven't seen anything to the effect of that swineherds were actually looked down on. I mean, I think it was just kind of a job like everybody else. But one of the key framing texts that people had in the Middle Ages for pigs was the Bible, right? So in the Christian Gospels, there are several stories which Jesus tells that have to do with pigs. And one of those, the prodigal son. In the prodigal son story, the prodigal son leaves his, you know, father, and he ends up falling into disrepute. And one of the reasons for that, he's so low, he has no money, he has, you know, and he doesn't want to go crawling back to his family. He ends up to be a swineherd. Now, the reason, of course, in the text, that's a very low job that you could have, is because in Jewish faith, you don't eat pigs. Pigs are unclean. So they don't eat pork. You don't eat any pigs. So he ends up to be a swineherd. Therefore, this is horribly like lowest job you could possibly have, right? You're sitting on the dung heap. So this story continues to be told, and if you walk into a medieval church, you may very well see an image of the prodigal son with his swine when he's at that low point. Because then, of course, in the story, he gets redeemed and is taken back by his father.
So those food taboos, Jewish and Islamic food taboos around pork, are they common in the medieval world? Are they things that people would be familiar with and conversant with, or more through the biblical context?
No, so they did know this, that because we also have to remember that there were both Jews and Muslims in the Christian West. They lived often in cities and settlements, and it was known that they did not, eat any pigs or pig products. And in fact, this becomes a negative association within the medieval world, in that these people can be associated with pigs. So one of the apocryphal stories that gains currency in the medieval period is a story about little Jesus. So they had a whole gospel that's the gospel of the infant Jesus. So when he's a young kid, so the story goes, that he wanted to play with some friends, or people he thought were friends, who are, of course, other little Jewish kids, because he was Jewish. And the parents are like, oh, weird Jesus there. He probably does weird stuff, turning rocks into, birds or something. We don't want our kids to play with him. So they hide their kids in an oven that's not being used as an oven at that moment. And then when little Jesus comes by looking for his friends, and they say, oh, no, our kids aren't here. He says, well, what's in the oven? And they say, oh, it's just pig. And so when they open the oven, of course, their kids have turned into little pigs. So this is the story. And so in the medieval world, you can end up with an association that, okay, but then Jews are like pigs. And unfortunately, that has some serious consequences.
I had for a moment in my head that the medieval world was much more inclusive, because people are conversant with these different faiths and these different attitudes towards pork and sort of dietary taboos. But clearly, that's not the case, and people were as bigoted as they are today.
Unfortunately, it does get that way. I think that you end up, particularly by the later part of the Middle Ages, you do start to get this association more and more with those negative qualities that we talked about first of the pigs. So, for example, that pigs are greedy, they're gluttonous, and that trait then becomes associated with the Jewish population.
So those kind of anti-Semitic tropes that still resonate today in problematic ways stem from this period. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? What about the boar, the wild boar that we picked up on in the first episode and we talked a little bit about? How do they play into this? What do people think about the boar? Are they greedy? Are they indulgent? Are they sexually prolific and dirty? I mean, yeah.
Yeah, so what's interesting is how they're entirely different in terms of what traits get associated with wild boar. Even though medieval people often draw them the same, and they make a distinction between this is a domestic pig and this is a wild boar, so a wild pig. But yet they're the same animal. So just so the listeners know, they're all sus scrofa. They're all the same. It's purely about breed. So genetically, they're considered the same species. But for wild boar, they're associated with nobility and with honor. They get put onto things like shields. So you'll see family crests that use wild boar because that's about, that they're fierce and they, go into battle, that they are, a noble, aristocratic animal. And this comes partly from wild boar traits that, well, they are fierce animals, that's associated with medieval hunts. So in the medieval period, normal people like you and I, we could not go and hunt for game. That was an aristocratic thing. So you had to be noble person who'd been given special rights by the king, who was allowed to hunt. And these were big affairs, like you still have like fox hunting, similar, where you go out with a whole team of people, some on horseback, some by foot, to kind of get the prey herded up. You have dogs. So the images, medieval images, there's whole descriptions of how you hunt wild boar, how you get the dogs to bring the boar close, how you're supposed to spear it. So it's actually really dangerous because of those techniques. So that's the other reason it's associated with, being noble as a prey.
So this is happening in woodland. This is in the same kind of woodland spaces where in the autumn people are bringing their domesticated pigs.
That's right.
But you're not getting the wild boar in the town, is that right?
No wild boar in the town. But wild boar will tend to be in pretty forested areas versus these domestic pigs. Most often, they're not going to be fed in a closed forest. Pine forest doesn't really work for them. That's not what they need. Because
they're maintaining the open woodland. Is that right? They're sort of, some of what they're doing is maintaining that open woodland, that sort of scrubland.
Exactly.
Space, yeah.
So they're more in open pastures, whereas wild boar are going to be often in a little bit more closed spaces. Also, wild boar are stalked. They're actually kind of in, areas like deer are stalked as well, even in the Middle Ages. so you would set that up, but they go extinct in Britain. Wild boar end up to be extinct by the 16th century, I think it is.
Okay, so pigs and boar are the same. They're basically the same animal, but this is the point at which they're beginning to separate, I guess, is it? Because they're being kept in different spaces, used in different ways, or have a different relationship with humans in different ways. They're being specialized. Is that right? That's the point at which they go in different directions.
Yeah, I mean, they do. Yeah, they do have a very different relationship. Yes, I think that's a way to put it. They fill different niches for humans.
It's interesting that one is domesticated and one is wild, yet the wild boar is allowed to be wild because of its usefulness to humans.
As prey,
yeah.
As prey. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And normally wildness seems like a bad thing that needs to be tamed, and yet in this context, wildness is sort of emblematic of bravery and heraldry and heroism. And
because of the danger that comes with it, right? So you're doing something heroic and dangerous.
And how dangerous were wild boar?
Well, they do have in the treatises that are written about hunting, right, how to handle them and things. They clearly understood that it was a very risky proposition to hunt them, particularly because you needed to get off your horse and you needed to spear the boar. So people did die in boar hunts.
Were boars held accountable for those deaths? Because we talked in the last episode a bit about how the pigs are sometimes tried for things. And I mean, maybe you could expand on that a little bit and tell us what pigs were tried for and how that worked. But were the boars, hard to put a boar on trial, I guess, if it's going to run amok in the courtroom.
So, I mean, my guess is, even if they ended up killing somebody in this boar hunt, the boar probably still ended up dead at the end, just because of the way these hunts worked. As I said, with kind of teams of people, and
Yeah, the boars don't come out favorably from that at all.
No, I don't think so.
So the pig trials, though, how did they work?
There's kind of this tradition, I guess I would say, that gets developed, particularly in France. They're the ones who we have the most evidence for these trials, where pigs who had committed a crime were then arrested. And as I mentioned before, pigs were seized all the time. Like if they were not in their pen like they were supposed to be, because the rules said you are going to have your pigs in your pen. You only take them out when they have a swine herd. So basically every town has this law. But so if they were caught wandering around, then you took them away and you either killed them or you found the owner and you collected a fine. But there were cases in which a pig got free and ended up causing significant damage that would go beyond just property damage, but actually damage to life. So because pigs will, eat just about anything and they are rather large, they can knock things down. So one of the things that they tend to knock down are cribs in the sources. But of course, you're talking about not that many over a very long period of time. But they will knock down, or a toddler, you see a little toddler running around, and a pig is loose, it might very well look like something you could eat.
Wow.
So they tended to end up biting one of these babies or toddlers, which then either, ended up disfigured or hurt, or in some cases killed.
So you can understand how pigs get a bad rep then, because they are clearly criminalized in this way for those kind of things. And
I guess it shows one, the immense proximity of pigs to people. If they're running around houses with access to cribs, it shows how close they are. But also, I guess that degree of wildness, even among domesticated and tamed animals, these are still wild creatures.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So they're still going to, find something to eat or, knock something down. I mean, they're also, as I mentioned, very smart. So pigs are known to get bored. Like they want to do something if they're by themselves.
Yeah, we had an artist called Andrea Rowe displayed some work with us some years ago here at the museum called The Pig Park and Other Experiments. Part of that was to do with an experimentation in allowing domesticated pigs, I think this was in the 1970s, somewhere in Scotland, to live in a slightly more wild way, to see how many of those sort of wild behaviours came back, the kind of pig nesting behaviours and sort of some of those soil turning behaviours and things like that. So she did some stuff that looked at that, but she also did some stuff that was related to pigs and play, and it was working with specialists in pig husbandry, and they were looking at trying to find new ways of providing stimulus for pigs kept in sort of farm environments. So she made a series of pig toys, including a barrel that when you rolled it, it had holes punched in the side of it. It was just an ordinary wooden barrel with holes in it, and out of the barrel, apples would fall. So the pigs, obviously, when they rolled the barrel, would eat the apples. We had a pig barrel in the back garden for a while of the museum that people could roll around, and apples would fall out of it. But they didn't eat the apples; they just left them. So there were lots of rotten apples in the back lawn of the museum. But
that would have been perfect for pannage.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I wonder, picking up on that thing about those sort of wild behaviours, that plays a part in, I think, some of those worries about reintroducing boar into England and having more wild boar in England because of those wild behaviours. Is that something that you've looked into or written about?
I did actually write one article that was specifically about kind of thinking about how people in the Middle Ages managed their pigs and whether that might be useful for restoration projects.
So this is looking at that kind of same culture of autumn pannage, that kind of thing, or
Yeah, and actually letting pigs run on, land at other times as well, because of their rooting behaviors, which may actually be really useful if you're trying to restore property from having been too managed in the past, right? You're trying to kind of do that rewilding.
So this is recovering farmland into sort of more naturally managed land and habitat.
Exactly. And so wild boar, as I mentioned, they actually become extinct in the British Isles, but they're then become reintroduced because they get out of what they end up being brought back to kind of this noble pursuits, having them in a kind of a pen. They end up getting out. And so now you have wild boar in places like the New Forest. And there are concerns, particularly with people who are hiking or walking, that they might get attacked by a large troop of boar. I don't know what you call it. If you could actually call it a troop. I don't know what you call it. Got to look that one up, guys. But how often this is really going to happen, I don't know, but they are large animals and they can be very aggressive, particularly if they have young.
That reminds me, there was a meme a few years ago about 30 to 50 feral hogs in the US, where someone was concerned about, I think it was gun restrictions, wasn't it?
I remember this meme. Yeah, I remember this meme. They can go wild. They can be dangerous. And yes, I mean, wild boar are large, and where they're particularly dangerous, and it was the same in the Middle Ages when they would hunt them, is the tusks. Because they'll try to fend you off, and you can end up gored by a tusk, and if that hits the right place, then that's it for you. So it's not. So we can't blame people, I guess, for being concerned about having a potentially dangerous animal around. At the same time, people lived with these animals for millennia, and you can find ways to live with almost anything, right?
Is that part of the paradox, I suppose, that these animals can be very dangerous, but at the same time, we are the ones who are bringing them into our lives? It's a deliberate decision to live with a pig.
Yes, that's a really good way of putting it, because it is this paradox of, that you can associate a pig with really negative traits, and yet you're perfectly happy to eat it, right? Or that the pig will eat anything, and that's somehow, it's both kind of negative when you talk about it morally or ethically, but it's a really good thing practically if you're going to actually produce a fattened pig.
So this brings us sort of full circle back to that sense in which the collections here at the Museum of English Rural Life represent that process of intensification of farming, the kind of specialization of farming, and in essence, the removal of animals from our lives in all sorts of ways, because that process resulted in harm to environments, natural, but also the removal of farmed animals from our day-to-day lives, so that we're not familiar with pigs in this way. What have we lost through that? And do you think there are ways in which we could be closer to pigs, both in a wild context, in a rewilding context, but also in ways that make us more familiar with them as a food source? Or
yeah, I think that it's about being aware, I guess, of where many of our foodstuffs come from, that there is this distance now to agriculture in general. So, everybody should go visit the Merle, because we often live in urban spaces now, we often don't see where things actually come from. And so I think that kind of knowledge and awareness is important. One, to make your own decisions, because I actually After working so long on this book, I don't eat much pork at all. I don't buy it, and I don't choose it whenever I have a choice. If somebody gives it to me, I, will eat it. But that's a choice that I'm making because I know a lot about pigs.
I can relate. I'm vegan actually, so I'm interested in this angle as well.
Yeah. So this is, and this is a choice one makes, right? But no matter what, you have to know kind of where these things come from. And I think their histories are also important. And that animals have been and continue to play really important roles in people's lives. Sometimes we just don't see them anymore. And I think it's important to see them. And so that's what I really wanted to do with my book, is to make them visible, because I kind of felt like people had not thought about what else is in the city, or the urban space, or what else is in the forest and the woodlands, so okay, there's trees in the woodlands, but what else is there? And there are pigs. Humans, yes, there's lots of humans in a town. That's why you make a town. But what else is there? Well, pigs and other livestock, they're there too. And all of these beings, and maybe this gets to what Ollie was saying before about agency, they all want to live. That's, and have a good life. And so thinking about the ways in which we do that and the ways we might be able to do it better, I think is really important.
That seems like a wonderful place to wrap up our conversation. Thank you so much for joining us, Dolly. Where can people read more of your work?
Yeah, so The Medieval Pig is the title of the book. So very straightforward, The Medieval Pig, published with Boydell Press. So you should be able to get it through any of your standard booksellers, either online or at your local bookstore. Just tell them to get you a copy. It's published there in Britain. So The Medieval Pig.
We'll put a link in the show notes to the book as well.
Yeah, and I'm going to give a shout out to Dolly's forthcoming book, Ghosts Behind Glass, which is coming out later this year, which is all about encountering extinction in museums. So I think we might have to lure you back on to talk about that, even though it's more about natural history collections and museums than it is about museums of rural life and agriculture. But I think we can find plenty of connections there too. So it'd be amazing if we can have you back at some point, Dolly.
Well, it would be great to talk to you guys again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.